begin by telling you my rather tragic but life-changing story. 33 years ago, I married my stalker. Yep, you heard me right. I married my stalker. Now, I was a pleaser. I was a good girl. I took care of other people's needs. I didn't know how to say no. So after he kind of wore me down and I started dating him, he suggests that we move in together. Now, I found some kind of ounce of ability to say no. I said, no. I have decided that if I'm going to ever live with a man again, I will marry him. Well, guess what? He says, marry me then. So I married him. At that point, I couldn't say no again. Well, we lived in Toronto, and after 4.5 months, I picked up and left. I came to my mother's place in Montreal, and I went into a very deep depression because I believed I had failed at marriage, and I was a failure. My twin brother came to town, and after months of this depression, he says to me, Karen, if you're thinking of killing yourself, I want you to call me first. Well, being a twin, I thought he could see in me something I didn't see in myself. So I was working at the time. I was becoming very frightened. I started to go into an even more deep depression and started hallucinating. One morning I got up, got in my car, got lost going to work. I had washed my hair, I had long hair at the time, towel dried it, hadn't combed it. I get to work and a colleague of mine says to me, Karen, we're going to find you a therapist. So she takes me to the hospital, I get a therapist. I also was not sleeping by this point, hence the hallucinations. And so a psychiatrist put me on sleeping pills. Well, the sleeping pills didn't work, they made me high. So now I need my sleep, I'm getting terrified. At the time, Brian Mulroney was in power, and his wife, Mila, had put herself in the hospital for exhaustion. So I thought, this is a solution for me. I'm going into the hospital. If Mila can go, I can go. I say to my therapist, I want to go in the hospital. She says to me, Karen, you have in mind that you're going to be in some kind of Swiss sanatorium, walking the grounds, looking at the mountains, sleeping, getting well. She says that's not what it's going to be like. Well, it never occurred to me I'd be put on a psych ward, okay? I didn't care. I was desperate. I mean, really desperate. I was so depressed. And, you know, with these hallucinations, like I was scared to death. So I packed my bag and I went into the hospital 3 days in a row before they finally took me in. The first day they sent me away. The second day they sent me away. So by the third day, boy, I was ready with my story. I told them everything. I'm hallucinating, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. You've got to let me in the hospital. So they let me in. Now, of course, since they did put me on psych ward, it was a locked ward. But because I had begged to get in there, I wasn't committed, so I was allowed to come and go as I pleased. And I began to regress. Now, the nurses all thought I was a journalist who had conned my way in there. Because I was a pleaser, and because every day I got up and showered and put on makeup and I was polite, I wasn't acting like the other patients. And they'd say to me, Karen, you really, you must be a journalist. You're just conning us here. And I was like, no, I'm not. So what happened is I started to regress and began to act like a child, started breaking the rules. My roommate had a motorcycle helmet in her room, and I took it and put it on one day and started bouncing back and forth in front of the grand rounds to get their attention because I had lost my therapist. She was part of the team, but I wasn't allowed to see her anymore. Now I'm doing group therapy with a bunch of people who can barely string a sentence together because they're so heavily medicated. I mean, honestly, so I was getting angry. And I started to access this anger in myself that I honestly never even knew I had. And I think, I think it's fantastic that I was on a psych ward because I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been in some kind of contained environment. Like, these angry feelings came up that I never knew I had. And since I was now acting out, another time I got in my car, I drove to the airport, called them up, the good girl came back, called them up and said, I'm going to Toronto. I'll never forget this nurse. She says to me, Karen, we think you should come back to the hospital. Get back in my car, back to the hospital. Okay, so now my psychiatrist sits me down and says, look, if you're going to behave like a child, we're going to treat you like a child. I am taking your rights away. You're locked in here, and you're going to have to work to get yourself out of here the same as everybody else. Well, that was actually fantastic because that's when I think my inner child was really, in a way, cared for, because he didn't get mad at me. He set limits. He contained me. He told me what I could do and couldn't do, but he didn't get mad. And I think the healing began then. I was able to access this anger, and I became much more whole as a result of it. Since then, I've been able to set limits, say no, be more assertive, be able to state my needs. Because if we think of Marianne's presentation with the inner child, that part of me I was not in any way in touch with it. I didn't even know I had it in me. And of course, we can't be whole when we're just being pleasing and accommodating and taking care of other people and not taking care of ourselves. So in the end, I really do think that it was a lifesaver, and I became the person I was able to become, able to live out my true potential, able to really have all the different feelings. And that pleaser was joined by my little rebel who could say no, who could act out, who could act childish, who could have fun, who could act like a real child. Now, our personalities are formed by how we think, feel, behave. What's the other one? Think, feel, behave. And believe, what we believe in, okay? We implicitly and explicitly get messages, as you've heard in the previous series, about who we are and how the world works. And for example, if I grew up with parents who were very anxious, I might develop a belief that the world is a very dangerous place. In my case, I grew up with people who were angry and unhappy, and I believed I had to put my needs aside, make the peace, not cause any more problems, be the good girl. When we believe these things as children, it fits our reality. But once we become adults, we have to recognize that those are childhood beliefs and they're simply not true. It's our work to become more whole and to become all of the parts of us so that we can fit into various different situations, be able to conduct ourselves. Now, what's hard is to change our personality, to really create the future that we want. We have to change how we feel, how we think, what we believe in. And that takes an immense amount of work, creates an immense amount of anxiety, because change creates anxiety. We're comfort seeking. Even if we don't feel good, it feels more comfortable to stay the way we are. And so in taking these steps of being more assertive, putting your needs out there, we're terrified that we're going to get the very thing that we think that we're going to get. But we have to take those steps in order to find out that, in fact, we don't get what we thought we were going to get, okay? People aren't going to abandon us. People aren't going to do all of these things. And most of the time, we're living in the past. So when we step into this new reality, we're going to easily be pulled back. Now, there's a billion-dollar industry out there that tells us just set goals and think more positively, okay? And yes, setting goals is good, but we need to take the steps to get to the goals, not just set the goals. And yes, we can think more positively, because when we do, in fact, it's not going to feel right. If I think I'm unworthy and unlovable, and I start saying to myself, I'm worthy and I'm lovable, I'm going to just recoil and be like, no, I'm not. That doesn't fit my reality. Now, what we know from neuroscience today is, in fact, if we do change those beliefs and start saying them over and over to ourselves, within a month, if we do it 3 times a day, we are actually starting to rewire our brain. So in fact, saying these more positive, truthful statements, because in fact, are we not all worthy and are we not all lovable? Really. In doing that, we will change our brains. But we have to watch out for the slipping back. Because being comfort-seeking beings, we want familiarity and we want comfort. And it takes a lot of work to make these changes. We might wake up in the morning. This time of year is a great example of this. You wake up really early in the morning. You feel exhausted. Anybody feel like that these days? You feel exhausted. You start to think negatively. And then we perceive our day totally out of those feelings and the thoughts. Then we have to tell ourselves a story from yesterday, from the past, as to why we're so tired and exhausted. I work too hard. There's too many demands on me at work. There's never any time, okay? And we start to feel worse. If we can catch ourselves, if we can become mindful in that moment, and I'm picturing myself leaning on the stove, waiting for the kettle to boil or the coffee to drip, and I catch myself there, straighten up, put my shoulders back, open my chest, and look around. The first thing I might think, I'm grateful for having a roof over my head in this freezing weather, okay? I might look out the window and see the sunshine. Haven't seen much of that these days. And think, I'm incredibly grateful that it's sunny out today, okay? And then we may start to think, I'm grateful for my partner. I'm grateful for my children. I'm grateful for my animals. Now we are shifting our perception into a much more positive emotional state, and we will perceive our day through that lens. So it's about becoming mindful and catching ourselves, because all of us tend to be living in the past on this automatic pilot, okay? So ask yourself, when was the last time I felt joyful? Take some time, write it down in your notebook. Okay, next question. Who would I be if I could cultivate joy? Who would you be? I'll tell you my answers. Last time I felt joyful was last night. I watched a movie that made me just laugh right into my belly. Every day I make a point of trying to laugh, and I really do have an ability to find the humor in the most ludicrous situations. So I do feel quite a bit of joy. But what would I do to create more joy? Well, I'll tell you the number one thing on my list that I would do is I would get myself into a 6-month silent meditation retreat. And I'll tell you why. I've done week-long meditation retreats, silent, and at the end of it, I have never in my life felt so connected to everyone. It's an unbelievable feeling, and the compassion just wells up. My heart feels full, incredibly sensitive, as Yale would say, but it's a wonderful, connected feeling. Another thing I would do is I would spend more time working on creative projects. I have an idea to design coats and handbags made from tribal fabrics by women that knit things and sew things by hand and combine them into artwork that you can wear on your back. And lastly, where I find joy is when I have a client that is really starting to make changes and I can see that they are living a much more fulfilling life, my heart swells with joy. So I'd like to ask you, would anybody like to share the answers you came up with? We'll bring around mics. Anybody feel brave enough? All right. Here we have 2 in the front and 1 on the further aisle over there.
Hello.
Hello.
I would actually go and read to the elderly. The people
Pardon?
that I would read to the elderly, people that have problem with their eyes, to bring them joy.
How lovely. Did everybody hear her? She'd read to the elderly. Lovely.
I do pet therapy, and I bring my golden doodle into inpatient psychiatry with patients, and it's an incredibly moving experience just to see patients speak to each other who are normally nonverbal. I just am there to accompany the dog. I would do that every day.
Lovely.
What I do to cultivate joy is participate in events that foster deep connection with other people, and I help facilitate them now, and that actually really amplifies my life, and I really appreciate it.
Lovely. Okay, thank you all for sharing. Now, why did we do this exercise? Because we all have a natural bias towards negativity, okay? It's natural. Every single one of us has it. It's the way our brains work. So we actively have to focus on more positive things. It doesn't come naturally, okay? And I really believe that if we could bring up more joy, get into a joyful state, if we could get all people in a joyful state for a very short period of time, I really do think we'd be able to heal this world that we live on. So now we're going to talk about another thing that we can do to actually create the life that we want. We're going to start looking into the future. We have to use a bit of the past to apply to this, but at the same time, what we're talking about here is focusing on what you would like your future to be like, okay? And in focusing on what we'd like our future to be like, what we have to do is get into the feeling of whatever it is that we want more of. We have to feel the feeling now, in the present, in order to attract and manifest whatever we want. It simply doesn't work to say, I'll be happy when I have whatever it is I want. It doesn't work that way. So think, for example, if you want more security, you might go into your past and think of a time you were in your grandmother's arms. Think of a time where you felt safe and secure. If you don't have that, think of a time when you're in your home and you feel deeply relaxed. Because a feeling of security and a feeling of relaxation are really very much the same thing. You conjure up that feeling frequently, and then that will help to attract more security in your life. If you want more money, who doesn't want more money? What we have to do then is get into a feeling of abundance. We have to feel abundant in order to attract more coming to us. So think of a time, for example, when somebody gave you a nice gift. Or think of a time where you had an excellent meal and you feel satisfied and filled up. That's a feeling of abundance. Now, if you want love, we have to conjure up loving feelings. If we're fortunate enough to have people in our lives that we can see that they love us, think about them, and then get into the feeling of being loved. If you don't have that, there's other ways to do it. Don't worry. If you have animals, think about your dog. Just that way your dog or your cat looks at you, and you just know they love you, okay? Or think about someone in your life that you love deeply, okay? And then conjure up that feeling more and more in order to be feeling more loving feelings. Our brain doesn't know the difference between what is real, or what is in fact happening, and what isn't. It responds to how we feel and what we think. So if we feel love, we feel abundant, we feel more joyful, that then becomes our reality, and then we attract what we want. In a moment, we're going to do an exercise that's on having no limitations, okay? But I want to set this up for you because we tend to be a little materialistic. So when we get talking about what would you want, you might think, oh, I would like a jet plane, or I'd like to live in a castle. And what I want you to think about with that is, yes, you can certainly put your jet plane and your castle on your list, okay? Don't hold back. But we want to think about what value that would bring to you, okay? Would it bring you more comfort? Would it be a time saver if you had a jet? Would you be able to have more adventure in your life? Things like that. What I want you to do now is let's close our eyes. Let's take a couple of deep breaths to center ourselves so that we can go inside. Breathe in deeply and out. Again, breathe in and out. One more. Breathe in and breathe out. Now imagine yourselves, you're going to live to be 100 in perfect health. You have $1 billion. And whatever you decide you're going to do, you are guaranteed absolute and complete success, fabulous success at whatever you choose to do. So think about it for a minute. Would family come to mind? Who would you surround yourselves with? Would you travel? Where would you live? When you start having ideas, take your notebook and open it so that you have 2 blank pages in front of you. And start to fill in. Write down the ideas that came to you, the pictures that came to mind. Okay, so now we're going to shift our focus. But before we do that, let's again take another couple of deep breaths, close our eyes, go inside. Breathe in. And breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. Now imagine that your circumstances remain exactly as they are today, except you've been told you only have 1 more year to live. You'll be in perfect health for that year. So what would you do? Would you quit your job? Does family come to mind? Do you start thinking about any relationships you might need to work on a bit? Would you travel? When you feel ready, flip over another page and write down the things that came to mind. Now I've put on the screen some values. This is by no means exhaustive. There's virtually hundreds of different values. But for the next part of the exercise, what we're going to be looking at, like when I talked about if you got a jet plane, what would that give you? Those are values. And to live a meaningful life, we really do need to live from our own individual value system. So now what I want you to do is look for the similarities between the two different exercises. Values, similar things you would do, themes. When you've identified them, circle them or jot them down. Have you written down the values? In looking at the similar things that you've circled, see if you can identify the values. I know you're still stuck on your limitless stuff, right? Millions of ideas coming to mind. Okay, now based on the values that you identified, what do you need to begin to change in your life starting today? Would anyone like to share? Oh, somebody way at the back up there.
I need the microphone. The interesting thing is that my the two lists match exactly.
Oh my.
It became the mirror image as you asked the second question.
Well,
Yeah,
congratulations.
thank you.
I'd say that you're well aligned with your value system. Anybody else? Yes, over there.
So do I also say like my dream and then what I would do if I only had 1 year left, or just the values?
What was that?
Do I read out like what my dream would be and then the sorry,
Whatever
and then,
you'd like.
Okay, well basically.
Tell us what you'd like.
Well, my dream would be to live in Italy and be a therapist and help people. And then if I only had a year left to live, it would be to help my friends and family and spread love and joy and tools for how to deal with pain. So I think they're pretty close.
Wow, yeah. Yeah. Maybe take a trip to Italy. So why did we do this exercise? Yes.
What is your definition of values? Because what I saw on your list were some things that I don't understand, how humor or fun is a value.
It's
What's your definition of value?
it's things that you value, that are important to you, that are the way you want to live your life. Okay, so humor, for example, that's a value that I hold. I try to find humor a lot. Somebody else might not, right? Compassion. It's a value that we hold if we want to be compassionate or kind. Does that answer? Yeah. Well, do you have a different definition?
My first thought was I was thinking about higher values, but obviously not.
Right, right.
Like truth is a value.
That's absolutely a value. Absolutely, yeah. And as I said, the list that we had on there was, by no means exhaustive. So for sure, spirituality, right? There's all kinds of other values, yeah. Okay, so as I was saying, why would we want to do an exercise like this? Because we want to get out of our old programming, this doing, okay, and not being. This just slugging through the day and thinking negatively and being tired and all of that. And the way to create the life that you want is by consciously working towards actually creating it, by focusing on the things we want, by getting into the feelings of what we want, and that starts to create our life. And I do, as I said before, firmly believe that if we could raise the energy level in all of us, that we would be able to heal this world and change this beautiful world that we live in that sometimes can be so cruel. So I want to thank you all for your attention here today, allowing me to share with you.
Thank you, Carol.